Welcome back. We're talking about the possibility of stronger ties between the United States and Russia under President Donald Trump. Let's get back to our panel. Anton, I just want to stay with you on one issue. You mentioned Syria. For Russia, that is a regional conflict, but Russia has been deeply involved in Syria, militarily, diplomatically. And in many respects, if we look at what's happening now in Syria, Russia's really upended the United States' goal of deposing Bashar al-Assad. There is going to be a role for him right now. Is this an opportunity for these two sides, two countries, to work together?
For the United States and Russia.
And Russia, yes.
Absolutely. I think the Russians came to the conclusion about a very uncomfortable and unpleasant truth about the Middle East, which is that secular and westernizing dictators are a better deal than fundamentalist-fueled chaos, which explains their support for Bashar al-Assad, for whom they otherwise really don't have much love and understand his limitations in terms of political survivability in Syria. But they've thrown their weight behind him because at least he represents someone to negotiate with. The ball really is in the court of the United States on the Syria question, clearly right now, because it's up to the White House to decide to what extent it would like to be involved. The Russians are in a fairly good position because they will play the mediators between Washington and Iran, and that will make them central as is. And again, as I said before, only good can come from cooperation between these states, but it won't be easy.
Nikolay, what about the role of Iran? Right now, Iran and Russia are on the same side in that Syrian conflict. There are some commentators who would say that this is a relationship of convenience between Russia and Iran. They point to the fact that the Romanovs in Russia treated the Iranians very badly. But is it U.S. policy in one respect to break up that relationship, that closeness between Moscow and Tehran?
There is a short answer to this question. Washington can try. And I am pretty sure American diplomats and especially members of foreign political establishment in D.C. Would love to see this relation broken. But on the other hand, we know, and that's the truth for Russian-Chinese relations, Russian-Iranian relations, the relations with Bashar al-Assad, with Israel, with several countries in Europe and in South Asia and Southeast Asia, with the Gulf state, with Turkey. Russian foreign policy is national interest based. And this is true for how Russia sees itself in the world, and Russia is always eager to understand what are the interests of other countries and where is the space for negotiations. Nobody is saying in Moscow that Russia is going to develop 1,000 years friendship between Russia and Iran, or for that matter with any country. But on the other hand, there is clear goals in the Middle East where Russian and Iranian interests coincide. And that is a good basis for working to achieve these goals together.
Brian, getting back to sanctions imposed by the United States and its Western allies in Europe on Russia. There's been speculation in Washington that President Trump wants to remove these sanctions, that he might do so unilaterally. There's been a lot of opposition to that. But where do you think it lies? Will President Trump be looking for some kind of quid pro quo agreement here? We'll lift sanctions, maybe we can do a deal on arms.
Well, I think Donald Trump wants an arms race because he's promising the military that there will be a massive new development of U.S. weapons, conventional and nuclear. Trump says different things different days, so we can't really use him as an exact compass. Nor should we make any predictions. I've given up making predictions, especially since the 2016 election. But here's the issue, I think, fundamentally. If Trump unilaterally lifts sanctions, Trump is a strong leader, an unpredictable leader. If he goes ahead and tries to lift sanctions unilaterally, I think that will create a firestorm within Congress and amongst the Republican Party, among the neocons from both parties. I don't think that's going to happen. I personally don't believe it. Again, I'm not making predictions. But the reason is that Trump will use the lifting of sanctions as leverage for something, because that's the thing, the art of the deal, which of course all politicians do and all powers do. But Trump prides himself on that. So what is it that the United States really would want from Russia? As Anton said, the United States has been excluded from Syria. They are out of Syria. Now they're calling for safe zones, and the Saudi government says it too wants safe zones. Now, safe zones could mean different things, but it could mean that the United States has its own sphere of influence within sovereign Syria, something that would be militarily protected by the United States. The Russian government right now and the Syrian government are against that. It's possible that Trump, trying to become relevant again in the struggle against ISIS in Syria, would try to see if the lifting of sanctions could be leveraged for the re-entering of the United States into the final resolution in Syria, because that resolution is going to come.
And if we talk about safe zones, I mean, is it too far-fetched, Anton, to talk or to see the Russian military and the U.S. military actually working together?
No, at all, not at all. And there's actually a very interesting historical precedent, two of them, for this kind of arrangement, and that's post-war Germany and post-war Austria, which were run by an Allied control council of the Allies. Of course, back then the British and the French were involved. But a deal on Syria could resemble something like the joint occupation and running of Germany afterwards, except, of course, I don't expect that there will be nearly as many troops in Syria as there were before. But the basic arrangement will be to preserve Syrian sovereignty, to keep the state as a whole, but to slice it up into areas of interest, almost like the Allied control zones between the Turks, potentially an area where the Iranians will have influenced the Russians and the Americans. And given the fracturing of the Syrian state, this may not be the worst transitional period until Syria begins to put itself back together and Assad is transitioned out of power. So I agree with Brian completely. This may be the deal that Putin's willing to make, and he won't be giving up much in exchange for the lifting of sanctions. The Russians aren't that invested in Syria, despite how that's been portrayed in the mainstream Western media.
But it does give the United States a role, a military role in Syria.
Of course, and it gives the two militaries a way to cooperate and to reopen a very active dialogue. There'll be opposition on both sides, there always is, but the collateral benefit for Russia may be an agreement on Ukraine in the long run. So Putin's a strategic thinker. He does have a tendency to think through several steps ahead. This may be one of the scenarios.
Right. Nikolay, let me ask you about NATO. Where does NATO feature in the relationship between the United States and Russia? We know that Russia treats NATO as a hostile organization and feels that, in many respects, NATO betrayed Russia by expanding eastwards after the fall of the Soviet Union. So where does NATO fit in right now?
It's very difficult to argue that NATO is not a friend of Russia. And the simple question, what is the goals of NATO, how NATO sees Russia, this question, when answered, allows us to understand why both the decision makers, special decision makers, and general population of Russia sees NATO not as a friend. And on the other hand, we can say that NATO is not an independent player, and basically everything will depend on the decisions which will be made in Washington in terms of U.S.-Russian relations, in terms of relations with American relations with European countries, in terms of what is going on in the Middle East. And I would like to go a little back to these questions about sanctions and when it's a bargaining card. For sure, I can see that President Trump, being a skilled negotiator, can see these sanctions as a card, as a factor. he can use during the negotiations with Russia.
Right.
But on the other hand, it's crucially important to understand that sanctions and there is the goal of lifting sanctions is not the main goal of Russia. The meaning of sanctions, especially American sanctions against Russia, is very overestimated, especially in the Western media.
Right.
And this view also gives Moscow more space for negotiations.
Okay, and we are going to have to leave it there. Gentlemen, thanks to all of you for being with us.